Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So this is the third video on writing, the third and final video on this. And basically this video is just kind of a wrap-up of this topic. There are just some extra things that I wanted to say about writing that I didn't have the time for in the last video. We've done the heavy lifting for this topic. We did it in the last video when we talked about archae-writing and what writing means for Derrida. But there are just some things that are just some extra ideas that I wanted to include in this topic here. The first of which is, so I've divided this video into three sections. The first one is I want to revisit what we said about Saussure's principle of the arbitrariness of the sign, if you can remember that back in the video on signification. I didn't quite treat that properly. I was a little vague actually, and there's just a couple of one particular point that I didn't quite nail, and I want to just go back to it. And it is connected with writing a little bit, so, and this is why I caught it when I was preparing for this subject, and didn't see it when I was dealing with it in signification. But I want to revisit that and just tidy that up. The second part is going to be picking up what Rousseau and Saussure had to say about the violence of writing, and instead of just leaving it with their opinions, I want to introduce here what Derrida has to say, his response to Rousseau and Saussure. And then finally, just a few extra points, extra ideas about writing that surface in the book Writing Indifference, the collection of essays. And there are a few things that I think are relevant and interesting regarding Derrida's position on writing that crop up there, so I just want to include those as well. And with that said, we're into the first part, which is Saussure's principle of the arbitrariness of the sign revisited. Okay, so like I said, in the video on signification, we talked about the two principles that Saussure identified as being the ground or the foundation of general semiology and linguistics. And those were arbitrariness and difference. And in the video on signification, I discussed those and kind of imported them as they were from Saussure into Derrida's philosophy, as if they kind of, Derrida took them up. And that's not quite right. And the problem, so difference is fine, but the problem is with the arbitrariness principle. So I want to treat that again here. So in that original video, I said Saussure didn't see the arbitrariness principle as meaning that the signifier can be anything. Rather, he saw it as suggesting there was no natural attachment between the signifier and the signified. This is correct. But then I went on to say that the lack of natural attachment meant or referred to a synthesis in which the completely other announces itself as such, without any simplicity, any identity, any resemblance or continuity within what is not it. And this is not right. That's not Saussure's position, and it's not what Derrida takes. It's not Saussure's position, therefore it's not what Derrida takes on. As Derrida explains Saussure's arbitrariness principle, he says, for Saussure, there is a natural relationship between voice and sense in general. So, meaning phonic signifiers and what they signify. And this relationship for Saussure is natural, as opposed to the unnatural relationship, or the cultural maybe, but the derivative relationship that written signifiers have with their signifieds. So it goes back to that idea of there being something privileged about the voice in speech. And Saussure says the only natural bond, the only true bond, the bond of sound. And this is not arbitrary. So there's a natural relationship between voice and sense. This is essential. It's not arbitrary. However, within this domain, the relationship, the specific relationship between each determined signifier and determined signified would be arbitrary. That is to say, lacking a natural attachment. So in general, for Saussure, the phonic signifiers and what they signify is non-arbitrary. It's essential, it's natural. There's a natural connection there in general. But when you drill down to look at individual specific signifiers and what they signify, still talking about phonic and speech, when you drill down and look at those individual, at an individual level, the connection between those two specific sounds and what they mean is arbitrary. There is no natural connection between individual specific signifiers and their signifieds. But in general, that realm of phonic signification, that is non-arbitrary. It's essential. It has a privilege for Saussure. And so it's not Saussure, if you remember that quote I just showed you before, it's not Saussure who makes that claim about why or what this lack of natural attachment means. Rather, it's Derrida. So it's Derrida who says the unmotivatedness of the sign requires a synthesis in which the completely other announces itself as such, without any simplicity, any identity, any resemblance or continuity within what is not it. So this is Derrida imposing what is actually a reinterpretation of Saussure's arbitrariness principle. In other words, Derrida is actually denying the arbitrariness principle as Saussure envisaged it. And the way that he's denying it or rejecting it is he says signs are arbitrary, or in his words, unmotivated, not because there's no natural attachment between signifiers and signifieds. Derrida rejects the notion that the relationship between voice or sound and what it means is natural in any way. Rather, he's saying that there's no, so he's saying signs are arbitrary because signs function as syntheses between signifiers and signifieds that lack simplicity, identity, resemblance, or continuity. In other words, the connection between these two includes a completely other within them, i.e., it includes the trace. And that means difference, rather than there being I don't want to say natural, but rather than there being a non-arbitrary link between the two, which would be one of simplicity, identity, resemblance, or continuity. They're connected. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is one of complete otherness. It's one of the trace, which means the trace for Derrida, which means difference. So Derrida says the very idea of institution, hence of the arbitrariness of the sign, is unthinkable before the possibility of writing and outside of its horizon. So to talk about arbitrariness is already to invoke writing, that is to say, archi-writing, difference, trace. In other words, in order to talk about natural, as in there being a natural attachment or lack thereof, we already need signs, we already need signification. So to define signs by reference to a natural bond or lack thereof is incoherent. So he's rejecting Saussure's identification of this principle of arbitrariness as being at the ground or the foundation of semiology and linguistics, simply because in order to talk about arbitrariness, we need this notion, as Derrida explains it, we need this notion of the trace. And the trace is not more natural than cultural, not more physical than psychic, biological than spiritual. It is that starting from which a becoming unmotivated of the sign is possible, and with it all the ulterior oppositions between physis and its other. So the trace in this domain as archi-writing makes possible the arbitrariness or the unmotivatedness of the sign as the synthesis of the signifier and the signified. And since oppositions, for example, natural and cultural, can only arise from this, then they have no foundational role in signification. So the long and the short of this is that concerning those two principles of Saussure's, which he placed at the foundation of semiology and linguistics, Derrida has this to say: henceforth, it is not to the thesis of the arbitrariness of the sign that we will appeal directly, but to what Saussure associates with it as an indispensable correlative, and which would seem to us rather to found it, the thesis of difference as the source of linguistic value. So the arbitrariness principle basically is out, the differential principle is in, and that makes sense because everything comes back to difference with an A, right, for Derrida. Okay, so let's move into the second part of the video, which is the violence of writing revisited. So the idea with this section is, like I said at the very beginning, just to revisit what Rousseau and Saussure have to say about the violence of writing and just basically get Derrida's response. So we'll start with Rousseau's tyranny of the letter, which was where writing overstepped its bounds and actually changed something in speech. The specific example we gave was the way it changed the pronunciation of a certain word. And in response to this, Derrida asks, where is the evil? What has been invested in the living word that makes such aggressions of writing intolerable? Where is the sacrilege? Why should the mother tongue not have a history or produce its own history without ever being affected by any outside? So basically just directly questioning the privilege of speech. Why should speech have this special status? Why must it be seen to be completely self-contained and pure without any external, without being susceptible to any external influence? Like I say, directly questioning that. Moving on to Saussure's usurpation, which was the way that writing substitutes itself for speech. So again, overstepping its bounds and replacing the very thing which was its origin. And so Derrida says about this that Saussure never properly questioned this. So he says that Saussure explains the usurpation as being due to the natural bias we have for speech. And we talked about this in the last section, the way we see as natural the bond between voice and sense, and as artificial the institution of writing. And this natural bias he explains by reference to psychology, a psychology of the passions or of the imagination. And this, finally, Derrida says, is why for Saussure all linguistics, which is a determined sector inside semiology, is placed under the authority and superiority of psychology. So that's quite a nice little chain there. Saussure says or understands this usurpation, the reason that we see this as a usurpation of writing over speech is because we have a natural bias for speech. And that natural bias arises out of our psychology, our psychological makeup, if you like. Hence, if we want to understand linguistics, we have to look to the discipline of psychology. That's where our explanations will lie. And this whole explanation for usurpation is inadequate for Derrida for two reasons. The first one turns on this idea of psychology, the idea that psychology is somehow responsible or behind our linguistic preferences or the way that signification works. And psychology is inadequate for this task, Derrida thinks, because what Saussure means when he says psychology is a psychology of consciousness. So fully present, fully positive. Whereas for Derrida, he says writing, which is a part of linguistics, is founded on two absences. The absence of the signatory and the absence of the referent. In fact, he just says writing is the name of these two absences. And since writing is founded on absence, it's never going to be explained through a psychology of consciousness, which is consciousness deals with us as present, self-aware, all of those connotations that Derrida disfavors. So let's just have a look at these absences in a little bit more detail. The absence of the signatory first. And I think the signatory can be seen to be absent because just for the simple fact that they're no longer physically there. They've kind of left their speech behind, and you can pick it up and review it without them being there to defend it or to explain it any further. But in any case, the writer is absent. And also because the signatory is absent because we are not primal wills, i.e. we are not solid, we're not a solid present core of consciousness. There's this whole unconscious aspect to us, which is, Derrida will argue, at least as important, if not more important than this surface layer, which is our consciousness, of which we are, our self-awareness, our presence of mind, we would say. There's this much deeper background to that, which is actually more important, and so this is another way in which the signatory, the writer, is absent from their work. But of course, we're not dealing with black and white absolute distinctions in anything, in philosophy really in general, but in particular with Derrida. So in another sense, the right is not actually absent. They are instead, they're present as trace. They're present but crossed out, we could even say, invoking Derrida's sur retour, that practice of crossing out a word, so that the signatory, the writer, is present in their work, but present in their absence, present as absent, we could say. So that's the signatory. The referent, or the signified, is also absent because, and the reason for this, I think, is that signification is a never-ending process of signifying. Again, play, creativity, there's no final transcendental signified where the chain of signification stops. So the referent is absent in that sense as well. There's no transcendental, absolute referent. And like I said, as absences, these things can never be explained by a psychology of consciousness, which is fundamentally characterized by presence. So that's the first reason Derrida disagrees with this explanation that Saussure offers, psychology. The second reason is that he says it doesn't even properly explain usurpation. Rather, it just presupposes a natural bias to justify our reaction of indignation at how writing is substituting itself for speech. So Derrida takes it upon himself to explain usurpation, which he does in the following way. Such a reversal of power cannot be an accidental aberration. Usurpation necessarily refers us to a profound possibility of essence. This is without a doubt inscribed within speech itself. And this possibility is archewriting, or difference with an A. And so his explanation for the usurpation, the way that writing substitutes itself for speech, is that speech is actually writing at its core. So it's not really a usurpation, it's more like what speech is at its heart, coming to the fore, being fully expressed. Okay, so that was Saussure and usurpation. And finally, in this topic of the violence of writing, we have what Saussure had to say about non-phonetic writing as crisis. And this was in relation to the more natural, again, that word natural, connection that exists between speech and phonetic writing. And regarding this, Derrida says that phonetic writing is actually impossible for two reasons. The first one, phonetic writing does not exist. No practice is ever totally faithful to its principle. One can already remark massive phenomena in mathematical script or in punctuation, in spacing in general, which it is difficult to consider as simple accessories of writing. So in other words, writing always includes non-phonetic elements, punctuation, spacing, etc., that are not merely additions to writing, but that are essential to it, that go towards making up what writing is and how it expresses what it intends to express. In addition to this, Derrida says that phonetic writing is impossible because there is a silence inherent in difference. As Saussure himself says, the play of difference is the functional condition, the condition of possibility for every sign, and it is itself silent. The difference between two phonemes which enables them to exist and to operate is inaudible. So that difference that is at the core of signification is inaudible, is silent, is non-phonetic, in other words. And of course, the same is true for speech. If Derrida says there is no purely phonetic writing, it's because there is no purely phonetic phony. And that's quite a nice little point. There's no purely phonetic phony. Even behind speech, there is this inaudible, non-phonetic difference. So the crisis then of non-phonetic writing that Saussure talks about is actually a red herring, or it's an illusion, because there is no truly phonetic language. There's no truly phonetic writing, but there's not even a truly phonetic speech. And this idea of the non-phonetic is kind of interesting to follow up on. Derrida talks about pure writing as being non-phonetic. What writing itself betrays in its non-phonetic moment is life. It menaces at once the breath, the spirit, and history as the spirit's relationship with itself. It is their end, their finitude, their paralysis. It is the principle of death and of difference in the becoming of being. If the non-phonetic moment menaces history and the life of the spirit as self-presence in the breath, it is that it menaces substantiality, that other metaphysical name of presence, of ousia. First, in the form of the substantive. Non-phonetic writing breaks the name. It describes relations and not appellations. The name and the word, those unities of breath and concept, are effaced within pure writing. So the phonetic or speech is connected to breath, spirit, life. The non-phonetic then is a threat to all of this. It represents the opposite: end, finitude, death. And again, just looking at some of the contrasts between phonetic and non-phonetic that Derrida points to in that quote, the phonetic as being is also menaced by the non-phonetic as becoming, i.e. difference. And again, the phonetic as substance, the presence of a name, a word, a noun, an appellation, is menaced by the non-phonetic, which breaks the name, Derrida says. It describes relations, not names. And with that quote and the way that Derrida sees pure writing as non-phonetic is I think, or it shows us, I think, that writing is actually violent. There is this violent core to writing, but just not in the way that Rousseau and Saussure were suggesting. They were suggesting writing's violent because it illegitimately, it seeks to take over that which is actually primary, that which is actually privileged, is natural in some way, speech. And Derrida is saying writing is violent, but not illegitimately. It's violent in that it's in a sense it's reclaiming its title. It is the origin of speech. And so when it comes back in the form of, in this non-phonetic form, it's reasserting itself. It's making known. It's making itself known as that originary source, which has been covered over by speech. Okay, so let's have a look at the third section, which is just general comments about writing from writing indifference. All right, so the first point, I've just got 5 points that I want to run through reasonably quickly, I think. The first one is anti-idealism. So this is, what Derrida means by this is that there's no pre-existing meaning. And he references Merleau-Ponty actually when he talks about this in Writing Indifference, where Merleau-Ponty says communication is not a writer conveying meanings that already exist in their mind. Communication instead brings these thoughts about. So it's what makes these thoughts come out. And this is kind of the opposite of how we normally think of it, right? We think we have our thoughts, and then when we write, we're just communicating what's already in there, in our minds. And Merleau-Ponty's saying that's false. There's nothing before the writing. The writing is the communication, as writing is what brings these thoughts about. And Merleau-Ponty says a really nice quote: "The writer's thought does not control his language from without. My own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think." I love that last quote. So the writer's thought doesn't control his language from without. We don't control the language that we're using, whether it's speech or whether we're writing. We don't control them from a distance. We are engaged in that process. Our thinking is caught up in the writing or in the speaking. It's not removed. It's not one step removed from it, and the problem is just how to get across what I have already formed in my mind. And my own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think. What a great line that is. And I think anybody who's involved in any kind of creative work will resonate. That quote will resonate with them. And for me, specifically regarding writing, as a writer, I do a lot of writing, and the writing that I do is it's philosophical. It's philosophical. So I'm always trying to explain complex ideas, make sure my arguments all line up, and all of everything is logical and consistent, coherent. And sometimes the things I'm trying to explain are difficult to understand anyway. So when I write an article, I often start with what I want to say. But when I finish, sometimes it's gone in a completely different direction, because as you're writing, you see things that you didn't see before you started writing. So you realize maybe that argument doesn't make sense. Something's wrong. It's not quite the way I thought. And sometimes what I've written, what I've intended to write, has actually turned out, what I've actually written has turned out to be the opposite of what I intended to write. Because in the writing, things become apparent that just weren't apparent before you started writing. So yeah, I really like that quote. Derrida quotes Merleau-Ponty: "My own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think." So yeah, anti-idealism, there's no pre-existing meaning, there's no pre-existing thought, which is just a matter of expressing. But also, in another anti-idealist idea, there's no central coherent consciousness behind writing. So the will to write is not the determination of a primal will, again that word. Rather, it reawakens the willful sense of the will. So emphasizing with that idea a certain lack of agency in writing. We talked about this earlier with the absence of the signatory. There is no... We think of ourselves as complete, present, whole, self-aware consciousnesses, from which we write, from which we speak, from which we communicate. But actually, that central, fixed, complete whole of self-awareness, that little ball of self-awareness that we think we are, is an illusion. There is no centralized, complete, coherent self. Rather, there's just more going on here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in subsequent videos when we get to the unconscious. But yeah, this idea that we are this central managing or directing will is an illusion. So that was anti-idealism. Also, another point is that writing, Derrida says, is inaugural. And what he has in mind with this is, he says writing doesn't know where it's going, not because it creates in an absolute sense, this is a theological idea, he says, but because it augurs. That is to say, it has the freedom to bring forth the already there as a sign. So it's not about, as I said, absolute creation. We're not creating from nothing. Rather, writing uses an alphabet or concepts as signs to generate in novel ways. An alphabet or concepts that already exist, but it uses those already existing things to generate something novel, to generate something that is. And this is what creativity is. So just, it's a fine line, but distinguishing between a kind of absolute sense of creation and the sense of kind of creating something new with what you've already got at hand. And so Derrida calls that being inaugural or auguring. Another point is the death of writing. Derrida talks about this. Writing dies, he says, when it's no longer utilized as a transition from one existent to another, i.e. when it refers only to itself. So when it becomes insular, inward-facing, self-contained, when it loses any connection to the external. So when there's no otherness to it, when there's no alterity in it. And another expression for this, I think, which I've used before, is when it becomes identical to itself, when writing becomes identical to itself, when it becomes crystallized as what it is without needing to refer to anything external, then it dies, Derrida is saying. And at this point, he says it becomes language. So that's interesting, just distinguishing between writing and language. Language is dead writing, writing that's died. Words with fixed, crystallized meanings that are fully independent and self-contained. Another point regarding writing is connected with what we just said, the other, bringing the other back into this. Writing, Derrida says, is a tearing of the self towards the other. And again, not self-contained, but moving. It has this external movement to it. And even in a literal sense, in writing for oneself, Derrida says, the writer's pleasure destroys itself in the plenitude of the identical. So again, just that, the importance of the other for Derrida, for that trace of alterity, to be within what you write, and even to be the sense that you are writing to communicate to someone. You're writing for that purpose. Otherwise, it all becomes insular, self-enclosed, and it loses its essence. And finally, metaphor. And metaphor, Derrida says, is the moment which carries language beyond peaceful certitude, beyond totality, into dynamism, creativity, play, etc. So language always illuminates and hides at the same time, because it operates within signified boundaries. So as it illuminates ideas and concepts, it hides the system of signification itself within which those ideas and concepts are operative. And the point that Derrida is making here is that metaphor transcends this. It transcends this limitation. Because with metaphor we have a situation where one signifier can refer to multiple signifieds. So it escapes that limiting boundary and kind of showing us the limits, showing us what's usually hidden. It reveals to us the system of signification itself that we're using. And he has a quote to express this from the philosopher Georges Batailleur. Batailleur sometimes opposes poetic, ecstatic, sacred speech to significative discourse. But this sovereign speech is not another discourse. There is only one discourse. It is significative. The poetic or the ecstatic is that in every discourse which can open itself up to the absolute loss of its sense, to the non-base of the sacred, of non-meaning, of unknowledge or of play, to the swoon from which it is reawakened by a throw of the dice. So discourse is always significative versus poetic or sovereign speech, which is metaphorical, which transcends the boundaries of that significative discourse. And the poetic then is that in every discourse which can undermine sense and throw light on the nonsense, the non-meaning, as Derrida says, the non-base, the unknowledge, the play that grounds it. And this is, of course, a reference back to difference with an A. Difference underlines or difference is that foundation from which everything arises here, everything we're talking about. The sense, the meaning, they all have their ground in a nonsense, in an unmeaning or non-meaning. And it's precisely that which metaphor or poetic language gets us to, or shines light on. So it just brings out this foundation that Derrida is talking about. Okay, let's have a look at a summary. So first up, we talked about Saussure's principle of the arbitrariness of the sign. And just revisiting this and correcting what I said earlier, Derrida actually rejects Saussure's principle. So arbitrariness cannot be the ground of signs because it's unthinkable before the possibility of writing, which is signification. So arbitrariness then, or what Derrida also calls unmotivatedness, refers to a synthesis of signifier and signified, which is founded on the trace, i.e. the other, i.e. difference with an A. So it's unmotivated or arbitrary for Derrida because it lacks identity, resemblance, or continuity, because it includes within itself that alterity, that otherness. And that's a reinterpretation of Saussure's principle of arbitrariness, and it diminishes it in importance because it's ultimately grounded on difference, which is the other principle that Saussure placed at the foundation of linguistics and semiology. Then we looked at the violence of writing. Here Derrida, we saw, rejects Rousseau and Saussure, their tyranny of the letter, their usurpation, and the crisis of non-phonetic writing. But Derrida says there is violence in writing because as non-phonetic, that pure writing we talked about, it menaces the phonetic. The non-phonetic in writing, in punctuation, and spacing, and so on, but also the non-phonetic in speech, which arose through that silence of difference, and the non-phonetic menaces the phonetic in a number of different ways, some of which we pointed out earlier: breath and life, menaced by finitude and death, being menaced by becoming, and the substantive menaced by relations, the breaking of the name. And finally, we looked at some general comments from Writing and Difference, the first of which was anti-idealism. So there's no pre-existing meaning. We don't have fully formed present thoughts in our minds, which we can then just express. In the expression, in the writing, the thoughts arise. So the writing, we think when we write, or perhaps even better, thinking is writing. And we also, in connection with this, we talked about the absence of the signatory. So there's no fully present, self-aware, conscious center. There's always non-conscious contributions. And in fact, the conscious self is just a fairly superficial layer over this more important unconscious. And we'll talk more about that later. We also talked about the way writing is inaugural. So it's a freedom which arises because rather than being an absolute act of creation, which Derrida called theological, a theological thought, writing uses already existing signs in novel ways. We also talked about the other as being central to writing as a tearing of the self towards the other, and writing, when it no longer does this, when it becomes insular and self-contained and inward facing, it then dies. And then finally, metaphor. So the way that one signifier can connect with many different signifieds in this dynamic, creative, playful sense. And the way this is opposed to significative discourse, and opposed in such a way that it undermines sense, highlighting the nonsense that grounds it, bringing into focus the system of signification itself that out of which our writing or our speech arises, placing the spotlight on that, and then we can see it for what it is, which is it's something without a foundation. It's something that is grounded in difference with an A. Okay, and so that is where we are with writing. yeah, the next video we'll move in to talk about truth and meaning a little bit. So that'll be interesting. I've got to prepare that, so we'll see how that goes this weekend, I guess. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully that helped, and I'll catch you next time.